So with that, I think we'll begin and get started with our program today. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Nunner, and I serve on the Women in International Trade, Anti-Corruption, and Corporate Social Responsibility Program section. I will be facilitating the discussion today. And as you all know, our mission at Women in International Trade is to really promote the professional advancement of women in international trade and business, to raise public awareness on the importance of international trade to economic development, and more. And we have a really terrific session prepared for us today to do so. Our topic today is what is the responsibility of corporations and their stakeholders amidst the pandemic and beyond? And are there lessons learned from corporations in specific industries, such as technology, that we should take forward into the future? How can companies address the needs and concerns of its workforce, and particularly for women? Amidst COVID and beyond, many stakeholders are considering new ways to invest, especially as they go abroad. How are companies encouraging ethical business practices and engaging with their stakeholders to help build trust in this important time? We have two terrific panelists with us today to explore these questions. We have Dr. Christine Cotier, who has over 20 years of experience in leadership roles across business, government, and academia, focused on areas of international trade, investment, and global strategy. She's currently at the London School of Economics as an associate professorial lecturer at the Department of Management and the academic director for the SEMS Masters in International Management. Further, she's a member of LSE's International Trade Policy Unit and a lecturer in the program of Advanced Trade Negotiation for the UK government, and she's a regular consultant to global companies through LSE Enterprise. Before she entered into academia, Dr. Cotier worked as an international trade negotiator with the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade Canada, representing Canada in negotiations with the WTO, OECD, and on bilateral trade and investment agreements. She's also worked as a policy and economics consultant with PwC and was a political advisor and organizer in the Office of the Prime Minister of Canada. Welcome to you, Christine, and thank you for being with us today. We also have Helen Shepard, who's an experienced corporate responsibility leader working at RELX, which is a provider of information-based analytics and decision tools for professional and business customers with more than 33,000 employees across 40 countries. She's responsible for human rights engagement in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including management of the RELX SDG Resource Center and advancing inclusion and diversity. She launched a Women in Technology mentoring program, now in its 4th year, to improve diversity in the growing technology workforce. She currently leads RELX's engagement with living wage assessments and is conducting human rights due diligence for the business. And externally, she represents RELX in the UNGC Action Platform for Decent Work and Global Supply Chains and Target Gender Equality. Welcome, Helen. What amazing experiences we have with us today. For our session, we'll begin with opening remarks from Christine, and then we'll go to Helen. And after that, we'll have a Q&A portion. So we encourage all of our attendees today to submit questions in the chat, which I'll be moderating throughout. And a reminder that we will be recording the session today to make it available as a resource on the WIT website. So Christine, with that, let me turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. It's really a pleasure to be here today to discuss this issue. I wanted to just start by saying that, unlike Helen, I'm not actually a CSR expert. So my research and teaching is very much focused on trade and investment policy, strategies of multinationals, particularly internationalization strategies with a focus on emerging markets. But having said that, when I found out the topic of the webinar, I thought it was very, very interesting, and I spent a bit of time thinking about this. Now, it's also a very broad topic, but I thought I'd tackle it in 2 ways. So the first thing is, I wanted to think about the ways in which COVID-19 has really challenged CSR assumptions, concepts, and practices for companies and governments. How has it done this, and what does this mind shift change mean for firms' responses? So that's the first focus. The second, I think, was to really think about the role played by the COVID-19 pandemic in heightening the importance of what we call ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance for institutional investors. So how have these new investor expectations, how are they driving this momentum that we're seeing among firms to incorporate such measures? So if I start first by thinking about how COVID has impacted our CSR assumptions, our concepts and practices with respect to sort of three areas: stakeholders, societal risk, and responsibilities in supply chains. So, first on stakeholders, I think COVID-19 has really served to illustrate who are the most essential stakeholders of businesses. So this is clearly frontline workers in healthcare, food service, delivery, and public transportation. And while, we've certainly applauded these workers over the last year, and actually, when I think about in the UK, where I'm based, the population literally spent 10 weeks straight with a weekly clap for healthcare workers. So while we've seen that, they're also the most exposed to things like infection. They remain poorly paid and economically vulnerable. And actually studies have suggested that COVID will exacerbate a lot of these inequalities. Excuse me. So further, with more people working from home, there's been this greater recognition of how much economic value creation really relies on these sort of overlooked and unrewarded labor that we see within homes and schools. So if we just think teaching, childcare, and care for the elderly. And I would argue on this issue of stakeholders, there's sort of a growing consensus over this last year that we need to recognize, or we need to reconsider, how value is really assessed and allocated if those workers that we're actually deeming most essential are still receiving such a small share. So, arguably we need new ways of thinking about the value that different stakeholders generate, and maybe better ways of capturing what we would call their indispensability to societies. So that's the sort of first reflection. I think second, with respect to CSR assumptions, concepts, and practices, we think about it in terms of societal risks. I think those have also changed as a result of COVID-19. So I think the pandemic, has certainly highlighted the role of business, both in terms of being a source of such risks, but also as an actor, maybe highly exposed to these risks, and one that needs to play a role in addressing them. For example, if we consider the possible origins of the virus, this raises the question about maybe the role of business responsibility in preventing such pandemics. But I think furthermore, COVID's highlighted the sort of social obligations of business to retain employees and serve customers with, very essential services. I think it's also put companies very much at the core of solving or containing the problem, as they have tended to be the ones that produce essential goods and services that we need really to address a lot of the social needs that have arisen. And you just think face masks, ventilators, vaccines, they really play a critical role. I think, so while previously CSR risk was maybe linked more to a company's bottom line, I think now the risks that connect companies to COVID are broad societal risks to which companies both contribute and are exposed. So again, I think there's a growing consensus, I would say, among policymakers, public policy advocates, companies, and also investors, that private enterprises need to become part of the solution, maybe beyond just complying with existing laws and regulations. And I think that the third way COVID has challenged CSR assumptions and practices relates to responsibility in supply chains. So obviously, over the last year, we've seen surges in demand, for example, for medical products such as PPE, ventilators, and also, shortages caused by stockpiling. And a lot of these things have really demonstrated the fragility of global supply chains. And this has obviously been, exacerbated, particularly with lockdowns and the effects that they've had on production. So what we've seen is, for example, sharp declines in consumer demand, which is not surprising given perhaps some lack of consumer confidence, maybe drop in purchasing power as people have lost jobs and due to lockdown measures. But this drop in demand has come at the same time as fall in the supply of inputs, for example, for some very vital products. And what this has meant and what we've therefore seen is that it's often been low-wage workers in these supply chains that have tended to bear the greatest brunt of the shocks, you know, many times with workers being left without pay, maybe employment in general, or even social protection. And what I would say about that is it's not all manufactured goods that have obviously faced this drop in demand. You know, some have obviously thrived, and you can think about, you know, where your purchases have been focused over the last year. And definitely areas like health products have done well. But some of it, however, have been more, I would say, greatly impacted and remain at high risk for high levels of job loss. So if I take an example, I think 73 million jobs are seen as high risk in textiles and garment supply chains, for example, if you look at International Labor Organization statistics. So this industry is one, for example, that's faced order cancellations, lack of payment for orders already in production as demand has fallen, you know, lack of consumer demand for the garments that they produce. And what that's done, obviously, within supply chains has you know, threatened the ability of enterprises to pay their workers. And often this has just disproportionately fallen on women who have tended to be in low middle income countries. So I think these events have challenged assumptions in CSR around supply chain responsibility and what was once seen maybe as the inevitability of offshoring by firms. In fact, I think firms' response that we've seen, you know, many businesses have looked towards localizing or regionalizing their manufacturing, really in an effort to make themselves more resilient in the post-COVID world. So it's become a sort of shift from to reliability, replacing low cost as a sort of main objective of supply chain management. But I think it's also highlighted the fact that firms need to really enhance transparency, particularly regarding their supply chains in order to reassure customers. So I think COVID-19 has really challenged these CSR assumptions, concepts and practices for corporations and for governments. It's highlighted, you know, as I said, the most critical stakeholders of business, these essential workers. It's also broadened the responsibility of business beyond creating shareholder value to become part of the solution in addressing societal risk. And as I've said more recently, it's reinforced the importance of responsibility, I think, and transparency in supply chain management. So that was sort of the first part of the focus. I want to just briefly address the evidence that I think COVID-19, the pandemic, has really heightened this importance of environmental, social, and corporate governance for institutional investors, so what we call ESG. And I think it's therefore, and the evidence suggests it's really driven momentum in firm adoption of ESG measures. And I think that's an important impact of the pandemic on, I guess, what we would term CSR. So I think there's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that certainly capital that's been flowing into ESG funds has more than doubled globally during the pandemic year, which is quite positive news. So when we talk about ESG funds, these are basically investment vehicles which are attempting to invest in companies that score, attempting to avoid investing in companies that score poorly on the metrics that measure what we might term CSR or corporate citizenship. And globally, so just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the change, in 2020, 75% of institutional investors say they incorporate ESG principles into their investment process. So I would argue that, you know, the pandemic is impacting ESG adoption, with investors looking for more company disclosure around social factors such as employee health. For example, there's also been a big push by investors to have companies provide a sort of standardized measure of disclosure on ESG issues. So you have the big investment firms or asset management firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which are very much endorsing reporting frameworks of this nature. This is also an area where the EU is very much at the forefront of regulating. So I would say that while the trend in ESG investing was already growing pre-pandemic, I think its growth in 2020 has really shown that companies that embrace ESG practices are really coming through the pandemic much more strongly. You know, it's interesting, the other shift that's interesting within this is that prior to the pandemic, I think ESG was very much focused on the E, sort of the environmental factors. So things like energy, water use, carbon footprint, waste management. You know, maybe issues like gender, racial diversity, for sure they would have mattered, but it was really much more about the greenness previously. And I think what the pandemic has done is also created this shift more towards the S, so the social, you know, really much more of a focus on wellness of people, the employer-employee relationship. So this is things like air quality that people breathe in a building, the duty of care that companies have towards employees, customers, for example, and really with the expectations going beyond just the legal, you know, to the ethical. One example, perhaps, of this decision by many firms is the decision around making the workplace more of a hybrid or working towards flex time. And I think that's becoming more of a permanent feature post-COVID. So just some examples, you know, firms like Dropbox, Shopify, Spotify, they've all already announced that all their employees are to work from home permanently. Companies like Facebook and Microsoft are among those that are allowing 50%, from what I understand, of their employees to work remotely on a permanent basis. So we've really, you know, seen some shifts in those areas. I would say in addition to the impact on staff and wider stakeholders, the institutional investors are also concerned about the supply chain risk and transparency. So that's one of the other areas that they highlight, but also board diversity and inclusion, executive pay, and still things like climate change have not, you know, fallen off the list of focus. So, I mean, just quickly to summarize, I guess not only has COVID, I think, highlighted some of the huge challenges and business responsibilities to help address them, I think the increase in investors pushing companies to adopt ESG measures has also risen dramatically. Well, I know it has under COVID. So I'll end there and maybe pass on to Helen.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was terrific. And I think a great way for us to think about some of these broad elements, you know, as a company like RELX is engaging in some of these areas. So I'm curious to hear from Helen about her perspective on many of these areas. So Helen, I'll turn the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really delighted to be here. Super interesting, Christine, to hear what you're saying. And I can definitely relate to, you know, particularly what you're saying around increased investor attention on ESG issues. We're a FTSE company, so, you know, we have investors, but yeah, certainly in the last year, we've always had like engagement with what's called the responsible sustainable investors, but now it has been kind of become more mainstream and diverted to our investor relations team. So yeah, and we're doing something, I think next month, you know, a specific conference on ESG for our kind of mainstream institutional investors. I can talk a bit more about that. I have got some slides that I'm going to share now. I'm going to kind of talk about our approach to corporate responsibility at RELX more generally, and I'll touch on some of the impacts that you know, we've had during the pandemic. I think that might now be sharing. Is that good? Yeah. Okay. So I'll start off by kind of focusing on what we mean by corporate responsibility at RELX. So for us, it's not a program, it's not a prescriptive set of activities. You know, we approach corporate responsibility at RELX as being very much what we're doing every day on a daily basis. It's very much embedded and linked to our core business. And so, you know, we're through our core business hoping that we will have a positive impact on society and minimize any negative impacts. We see that it's the responsibility of everyone at RELX, and we're a very small team in corporate responsibility, so we really rely on everyone at RELX putting corporate responsibility and ethical issues at the heart of what they're doing. We know that corporate responsibility gives us competitive advantage, but that's not just why we prioritize it. It helps us build good relationships with our customers, with our investors, as we've kind of talked about, now more and more with our mainstream investors, and with current and future employees. So people come to work at RELX and they stay at RELX because of some of the values that we hold. We have really embedded sustainability and responsible business into our values. It helps us build the relationships with governments, NGOs, and the communities that we're serving. And the tone is really set from the top. So our CEO, Eric Engstrom, has prioritized corporate responsibility. He's done that throughout his time as CEO. It's really important that we maintain these high ethical standards and that we're continuing to have this positive impact on society. This is our governance structure. I won't spend too long on this, but it really kind of shows that the tone is set from the top. It's our CEO who reports to the board in relation to corporate responsibility. He also has objectives linked to his remuneration around corporate responsibility. And then we have something called the CR Forum, which comprises a number of key stakeholders and leaders from within the business that we convene twice a year. So these are heads of procurement, heads of legal, heads of compliance, HR, and other business leaders. And they come together to help us set our annual objectives in relation to corporate responsibility, but they also are a platform for us to provide accountability. So, we need to be ensuring that every year we're progressing those objectives. So they provide an opportunity for us to kind of consult internally on what we're doing, but also, let them know how these objectives are progressing. And, it's not just us that are progressing them in the corporate responsibility team, but we rely very much on everyone at RELX to help us progress these objectives. And we do this through various corporate responsibility networks. That might be responsible supply chain networks, it might be employee resource groups in terms of inclusion and diversity, or environmental green teams, for example. Our global head of CR reports to the board once a year, sometimes more, to give that update as well on how we're progressing corporate responsibility objectives. And then here on the right-hand side, we conduct something called a materiality exercise. We do this every couple of years. And this is where we go out to various stakeholders, both internal and external, to help us identify what's relevant and most material for our business. And so we work with a third-party consultancy to conduct this kind of stakeholder engagement. And they've identified here, you can see some of the priority issues for us. And having the right people absolutely is a really critical issue for us. Without the right people, we don't have a business. And I think that during the pandemic, our people were impacted. One of the biggest impacts, I think, on our people is this shift from working in an office to working at home. So at the height of the pandemic, I think we had 94% of our people became home-based workers, and still a lot of people are now working at home. And so we had to navigate as a business a way of supporting those people at home, because certainly in the UK and in many other places, you're working at home, not just on your own, but with other members of your family. You have other responsibilities in relation to children, or perhaps caring responsibilities for other family members. So trying, I think the big focus for us as a business, and we were lucky that we were able to enable our employees to continue working and to continue working at home. But the big impact, I think, on our people was around like mental health. So during the year, we've had a focus on mental health. We've provided tools for employees to try and help them focus on mindfulness. There has been an employee assistance program that has rolled out kind of across all the countries that we operate in. And we're continuing to do that because the pandemic is still ongoing very much. So certain people are still working on at home. So I think that emphasis on kind of health and well-being and mental health was absolutely a big focus for us. When I'm talking about corporate responsibility at RELX, it's very much linked to our core business. We're a global data analytics business, and we want to be having an impact through that business, through the products and services, having a positive impact on society. And we do this through what we call our unique contributions. And so these are listed here. So universal sustainable access to information, advance of science and health, and this very much maps to one of our four businesses. So each of these unique contributions will align with one of the four businesses that sit within RELX. So advance of science and health maps to the Elsevier business, which publishes and lots of scientific and medical information, as well as having a whole host of tools to serve that community. And one of the things that they did throughout the pandemic was to put together a resource center, an information center, coronavirus information center, where they made, I think, upwards of 40,000 research articles on viruses for those kind of really at the front line, at the forefront of kind of developing, as you say, like vaccines or clinical care. So that was one of the things that our business quickly did in response to the pandemic. We have protection of society, and this links to our risk solutions group business. So this business develops tools that essentially are there to protect society, so fraud detection tools as an example. And one of the projects that actually started before the pandemic and has been continuing is around financial inclusion. So they identified that there are a huge number of people across the world that aren't able to access credit to be able to develop their businesses or to buy homes. And this access to credit, they are working on a project to improve access to credit for people who might have, their data might be incorrect, and that's why they're not able to access this credit. So this project is going on in Mexico, and they're hoping to expand it. But the Risk Solutions Group business also developed, looked at what data they could put out and make available to help practitioners during the pandemic. Then we have promotion of the rule of law and access to justice. So this really kind of links to our legal business. And we have a lot of projects around advancing the rule of law. I myself run something called the Rule of Law cafes, which are like informal gatherings of legal professionals. We run those in the UK, and we're now kind of expanding these cafes to other countries. We've run them in South Africa, we're looking at India and the Philippines this year. But our legal professionals, we have a really great team in Southeast Asia who, up until quite recently, were very active in Myanmar, for example, trying to work with the judicial system there and conducting programs such as birth registration, identity registration, so that people, particularly people living very rurally, could, have their ID papers registered. That was kind of a big issue for those people. So there's lots of really interesting pro bono projects that are happening across our business that relate to this kind of promotion of the rule of law and access to justice. And then finally, the fostering communities impact is linked to our global exhibitions business. And I think this is probably where, in terms of the pandemic, the business that was impacted the most, because it goes without saying, but suddenly kind of big, huge global events weren't happening last year. And however, our global exhibitions business really have tried to put sustainability at the heart of their shows, and certainly they've kind of had some time to develop that strategy. So last year they launched the UK business launched the Sustainability Charter, and today is Earth Day, so we recognise some of the shows that they have run in the past and will continue to run, like World Future Energy Summit and Polytech. So these are some of the exhibitions that really kind of focus on the environmental issues and climate action. And I want to mention our SDG Resource Centre. So about 5 years ago, probably coming up to 6 years ago now, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were launched and ratified by the UN in 2015. And we as a business wanted to see how we could support these goals, support the progression of these goals. And because we're a knowledge business, we have a lot of knowledge that we could make available for free. So this really kind of links back to that universal sustainable access to information. So in this resource centre, we've opened up a lot of content from within our business if it relates to one or more of these goals. And today we've also opened up a special issue that in support of Earth Day, and this content is freely available on the site. You can also see kind of in the on the homepage there, we have something called our SDG news tracker. So this is a tool within the LexisNexis business that shows the share of voice in the global media for each of the goals, and you can see how much attention in the world's media a particular goal is having. So I wanted to mention that, we continued to grow our resource centre during the pandemic, and particularly trying to find ways that we can make more content available for free. I mentioned already the Elsevier business have set up various information hubs, particularly, with the focus particularly on coronavirus and COVID-19 for clinicians and researchers. And yeah, last year we continued to look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we used some of our tools to put out these graphics. And these graphics show I suppose the research landscape for each of the goals. So they use these tools from within our Elsevier business, Scival and Scopus, that search citations, academic citations, and they show us, which countries are producing the most research, which topics, which are the institutions producing that research. I think what it tells us is the low-income countries that are most affected by these goals, or potentially most impacted by these sustainable development goals, are producing the least amount of research. But there are some interesting insights within them. And finally, because I know I've gone over time, I think, I work on inclusion and diversity within the corporate responsibility team, and in your introduction, Catherine, you mentioned that we wanted to kind of talk about how we're supporting people and impacts on women. So one of the things that I run is a Women in Technology program, so maybe we could kind of talk about that as the conversation progresses.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Helen. It's brought together a lot of the different elements I think that Christine highlighted in the outset. So a great way to kind of blend those two perspectives that you both have. I'll encourage our attendees to please submit questions in the Q&A for our panelists, and we'll start asking some questions. I think to begin, Helen, I wanted to pick up on that point that you had on one of your slides about, promoting the rule of law. And that's a big topic. I think that we're seeing amidst the pandemic is, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, many governments were looking to procure items at a very fast pace. And we were looking to have, some quick activity. I'm curious, from both of your perspectives, is that kind of heightened risks for corruption across, different supply chains, making sure we're promoting the rule of law, and what is the responsibility of companies kind of in that space as you think about, making sure that we do have that rule of law established?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. We are, we engage in a huge number of pro bono activities. So when I look at activities last year, they were very much, I would say, more impacted by what was going on around kind of racial inequality than perhaps the pandemic itself. So we've now got quite a big focus in our pro bono work and some partnerships that are just taking off to look at racial inequality and racial injustice. But I think as a company, you have to be aware of the risks, and when procurement is, when things are happening very quickly, or you're trying to move fast, sometimes it's hard for the law to kind of keep up. And we see that a little bit in the technology space when we look at, for example, the ethics. We have quite a big focus on the ethics of AI and the ethics of, some of our new technologies, and we see that the law is quite slow to catch up with the developments that are happening in technology. I don't feel like I may be experienced enough to answer the particular question around the legal landscape and procurement specifically and corruption, but I'm sure that it did kind of, there were some, certainly some issues, but companies already have quite strong systems in place, I would imagine, to prevent corrupt practices.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't have a ton to add on that in terms of, certainly there's as yet no, consistent, extensive evidence, because it's too early to sort of, be able to say. But I think the feeling is that it's having an impact on heightening concerns or risks around issues of corruption in various areas. And certainly, even just doing some research for today's panel, I came across a lot of discussion and articles out there talking about, counterfeit products, for example, in the area of healthcare products. So, whether it's, vaccine related, ventilator related, or so you are seeing those types of things. But I think one of the things it probably is doing, again, is sort of heightening risk and raising the importance of companies really having transparency and oversight and management of their supply chains, you know, in an effort to hopefully avoid and capture these, you know, problems as they arise. But I think, you know, we're still in the midst of the pandemic, so it's and it's only been a year, so I think it's hard to sort of say that there's any extensive empirical evidence to say it's been on the rise, but it's more anecdotal, and you certainly hear lots of examples of that.
Great, thank you both. I wanted to pick up on one of the points Christine made for you, Helen, about she had talked about, you know, the pandemic has really heightened and broadened the responsibility of business. And you outlined in your presentation that, you know, RELX thinks about CSR as a core element of your business. It's like what you do at the end of the day. And so I was wondering what you kind of thought about that statement and how you have experienced from the perspective of RELX, you know, the responsibility of business and maybe even those that you work with throughout this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely it has heightened the responsibility of businesses. I mean, you can see some of the impacts that relate to its workforce and you know, to a workforce, and how do businesses cope with this it's something that's happened very quick and the impact is very real, and ensure that, you know, if for a lot of businesses, you know, those businesses had to completely transform and in some cases just cease trading for temporarily, and so how do you support that workforce? And then for companies that, you know, like RELX, which were able to continue, ensuring that you're putting kind of employee safety and worker safety right at the forefront of what you're doing. You know, and also I think a lot of companies like ours were thinking, you know, how can we, what do we do that can support, you know, what's going on in the world? So whether it's kind of, you've seen companies that you know, give up their factories so that vaccines can be made, or, you know, that safety equipment can be made, you know, really kind of quickly changing, you know, what their focus is on. And we saw in one of our exhibition centres in Austria, so we don't own a lot of the places where we hold exhibitions, but in this particular, in Austria we do, and we transformed that into a hospital during the pandemic. So, you know, you're quickly kind of trying to adapt to what's going on in the world and trying to find ways in which you can support. And, you know, I mentioned giving content available for free to help, you know, the research community, trying to, you know, help, you know, develop vaccines essentially. You know, they're just small things that I think businesses like ours want to do. And I think there's a lot of examples. And I think about our community giving, you know, we have a very vibrant community giving and volunteering program, and a lot of charities were really impacted by the pandemic. It just threw their whole fundraising approach out of the window, basically. So especially charities that rely on business or volunteer support. So we were able to just look at our giving and say, right, well, the charities we've supported over the last few years, we're just going to give you a grant. It doesn't have to be tied to a program, because those charities are just thinking about how they're going to pay their employees and continue offering the services that they offer.
Thank you, Helen. Christine, the next question is for you. I know that you work mainly with multinational companies, you know, how they engage abroad. But I'm curious, as we know that one of the biggest impacts of COVID has had is on the small business community. And small businesses are also looking to try to figure out how they engage on some of these issues as well. Just curious if, from your perspective, if there are any lessons learned, you know, maybe in some of the themes that you highlighted at the outset, from the small business perspective, you know, as those businesses are trying to navigate some of these elements, how they might think about approaching some of the CSR implementation for their businesses too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Probably not something I've spent so much time thinking about, but I would suspect that the issues for them would be much more focused around sort of the workforce employee relationship, and also building those relationships, with suppliers in the community, and the extent to which they can take that sort of broader perspective in the activities that they pursue there. I mean, they're probably less subject to the same pressures that a multinational might be. They're probably less likely to be competing for investor funds by investors that place very strong, restrictions or have very strong views on what sort of policies they should have with respect to ESG. So for them, I think it's probably, very much focusing on those employer-employee relations and what they can do to facilitate the transition and the pain for their employees at this difficult time, whether that relates to, flexibility in how they work, or if they're, back in the office, just making that environment a safe one and facilitating things there. Beyond that, it's hard to say.
Thank you, Christine. Helen, I was curious if you have thoughts on that topic as well. Coming from a big established CSR programming, if you have advice for others who might be looking to create the same kind of programming for their organization, maybe at the smaller level.
Goodness, I mean, I think that the smaller organization, it's difficult because probably in a smaller organization, you wouldn't have a dedicated person that would be focused on these organizations. You wouldn't have a team of people. And so probably you want to think about, in every function and business process, how are you ensuring the responsibility and the ethical considerations are built into that. So, when you're procuring, are you asking the right questions about where these goods and products are coming from? Are you kind of conducting at least some minimum due diligence around that? And thinking about maybe what your business does. What would be your material issues or your impact on society? Like how if you're a drinks company, is there something around like water usage or so what would be the material issues for your company, and how can you? I think like you can't solve all problems, but kind of trying to identify the priority ones that would be for you as a business, and then trying to embed it into the functions of the business. That would be my advice.
Terrific. Thank you, Helen. I think as we're kind of wrapping up the Q&A portion of the session, would like to kind of hand things back to both of you for a last word, on these topics, and as different organizations are grappling with these issues and thinking about them from the whole of systems approach. Also curious too, just from both of you, what's inspiring you, what's keeping you motivated in this time as well? Are there any fun projects or different collaborations that you're working on that you'd like to share with the group? I know, Helen, you had mentioned some of the work on training women in technology that RELX is focused on. And Christine, maybe some areas of research you'd like to highlight for the women in international trade community. So maybe Helen, start with you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I'm lucky. I love my job, and I love the fact that through the company I work for, we are able to have this kind of positive impact on society. I think for us within the team, ESG is definitely on the rise, as Christine mentioned. So this coming year, we've seen already these, our team kind of responds to questions from investors on the topic. So that has definitely increased. And I think that it's really exciting that there's maybe increased scrutiny on this topic, because although, as a company, we prioritize these issues, I think it always helps to add leverage to what we're trying to do when, when there is this external scrutiny on these issues. Human rights is also being pushed up the agenda, and this year, I can't quite believe it, but we're celebrating 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So, you know, as someone who is very passionate about advancing business and human rights, that's hugely exciting. And we'll be looking at how we can, you know, progress that. And then I think, you know, inclusion and diversity came, particularly around like racial diversity, it became a very hot topic last year. And I think events that were happening in the world helped propel that up the agenda. We have quite a long time focused on women, and we still need to focus on gender balance and gender equality within our business. We have a really exciting Women in Tech program, which is a cross-business mentoring program. And actually I was just looking at some data on that program to see, I think, you know, it's really exciting to see that women that have participated in that program are being promoted through the organization. And so, you know, we have about 25% of our tech workforce are women, which is good compared to other companies. We definitely want to increase that. We set some inclusion goals this year, and having a goal around women in technology specifically, given our focus on tech, is important to us. So the mentoring program will continue, and I think we'll be looking to see what else we can do, like through maybe webinars internally, highlighting our female leaders, showcasing, you know, how they got to the positions that they're in now, and what others can learn from them, mentoring circles, for example. So there's quite a lot of exciting projects on the horizon for us, and I'm thrilled to be part of them.
Yeah, I mean, mine are of quite a different nature. We're sort of wrapping up our teaching term at LSE, so I'm very much focused on bringing that to a close. You know, a few new projects brewing. A lot of my work will be focused on preparing, you know, for the new academic year and integrating. You know, a lot of what I teach looks at a lot of these issues. You know, less just the CSR angle, but just the impacts of these types of things like COVID and you know, protectionism and what's going on with globalization and the impact for firms that are operating and investing abroad. So looking to sort of build in some of that sort of ever-changing material into in what I'm teaching, working on some, you know, case studies that also help facilitate that. One with you, Katie, on obviously renewable energy that we're waiting to hear back about, but others on extractive industries working in emerging markets and some of the risks and challenges that they're facing, and actually doing some consultancy projects on the side for a number of companies that are actually looking to become what they might call future ready or resilient in the face of you know, some of the challenges that we've talked about today. So those are the main things. Yeah, keeping me busy.
Terrific. Well, thank you both so much. I think you've given us a lot of different, you know, topics to consider as we're all engaging and experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, but also thinking about the role of stakeholders throughout all of this. And I like that last point, Christine, about being future ready, because I think all of our organizations are thinking about, you know, how we help continue to transform into the future and lessons learned that we can share with all of our different partners. So thank you both for this session, and thank you both for tuning in, you know, outside of the DC area. This has been a really fun collaboration and a great way to, I think, bring in different experts that we have in our WIT DC community to our broader set of stakeholders. So really looking forward to building on this collaboration, and just wanted to let everyone know tuning in that we do have additional WIT sessions coming up on our WIT website. So you should check those out. The next one is focused on trade and national security on April 27th. And then on May 13th, there's also a session on Africa trade policy in the Biden administration and more. So a lot of great, robust discussions for the women in international trade community. So looking forward to engaging with you all again. And just again, a big thank you to Christine and Helen. Really enjoyed the discussion today. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences.
Thank you, Katie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.